Welcome, everybody, to another edition of Coffee and Open Source. I'm really excited for my guests today. We're going to learn some fun things and talk about things that we really are excited about in the tech space and in open source in general. I'm excited for my guest today is Paige Bailey. Paige, do you want to say hello, introduce yourself? That's all that is really fascinating. And by the way, we fixed the audio. So
Oh,
hopefully,
awesome.
hopefully
Excellent.
going forward, the audio should be good. There's a lot of stuff to unpack there, right? I think even though there are some concerns about certain industries and how they take advantage of tech and things like that, but it sounds to me like there's all sorts of positives as well that tech can enable some of these companies to kind of do better with, right? Because you talked about telemetry and all these other things too. And it sounds to me, as somebody who just is generally interested in data, like there's like the earth creates so much data that it's impossible to comprehend, right? So being able to
Mhm.
effectively segment on that data and do interesting things is kind of, it sounds to me like that's what you like, that's probably your primary interest, and you just enable computers to get more insights on data. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely. And there are so many there are so many opportunities to do this in every single industry, right? Like really the sort of data science information worker, role of the future has only begun to start being investigated. And I adore for Chevron in particular. I think I had mentioned, the data sets for the subsurface are so locked down and they're all proprietary. And being able to kind of take those seismic data sets, either 3D or 4D seismic, and marry them with other kinds of data sources. So perhaps like understanding rock types or understanding sort of density or porosity or permeability, which is if you have fluids, how can they travel? How fast can they travel through rock? Porosity is just really how like how much of a particular kind of rock is free space. Permeability is how well those little holes are all hooked up together.
Sure.
Um, yeah, and
Interesting.
so yeah, it's fascinating to me how human creativity and sort of the way that people ask questions and think about problems. Like that's the only way to unlock any sort of interesting insights from data. It's all about who is looking at it, how well are they asking questions, and then also how quickly can they get back a response. And one of the things that was most frustrating for me, and is one of the reasons why I went into open source, honestly, is because these tools are really challenging for
Sure.
people who don't come from a computer science background. They might have questions that could help us, solve climate change or like better understand these really nefarious and gnarly systems. But they perhaps don't have like a 5-year education in like
Yeah.
making systems go. And they shouldn't have to, right? They should be able to go from like ideation to realizing some sort of insight as quickly as possible.
Yeah.
And yeah,
That's all really
so
fascinating. I think I'm like, it seems to me like you could have fared well, like I guess in a more typical like data science sort of role, right? But it seems to me like you want to take that one additional step where it's okay. I know a little bit of computing and how computers can help us. I love all this data, but I want to be able to tune it in different ways that maybe typical data science tools don't really have, right? Um,
yeah.
and I think you mentioned a couple of, I guess, technologies that exist, things like TensorFlow and things like that to help you with that. So when you came across something like TensorFlow or some of the other open source tools that exist out there, and you realize that it's like, oh wait, this stuff is free and anybody can use it and change it, like how cool is
Yeah.
that?
Exactly. And it's also, and it at times it can also be, well, like much better documented than proprietary offerings. Like there was a tool when I was doing the NASA work. It's called IDL. It's like a janky version of MATLAB. But I was so shocked to learn that like the IDL kind of method of doing data analysis was dramatically inferior to, there's another library in Python called, I think it was called AstroPy back then, but it allowed you to do the exact same thing for free and much easier.
Yeah.
And it was absolutely mind blowing. And I love the idea that, open source, there's this great quote about no matter where you work, most of the smart people work someplace else.
Sure. Sure.
And exactly. And I love the idea that there are so many people that are tackling the same problems, but they're doing it all together, different companies, but the same team. And
Yeah.
so that was my thing. And I adore the idea of finding ways to make these tools easier to understand and easier to use. Because, giving somebody an analysis, that's great. Like
Yep.
finding insights yourself, that's great. But if you give people tools, that's the best gift you can give anybody, because it means that you're
Yeah.
giving them the ability to create themselves.
Yeah. One thing I think that's I think, and this is probably isn't fair, but I think data science as it relates to computer science is something that it's a fairly newish concept, right? Like in the past, there's like these people that would have all this access to data and they would crunch numbers using programs, but whatever. But now we've seen this kind of bridge where people that are in that more traditional data science space, they need to learn, things like PyTorch, things like TensorFlow, all these sort of, I don't want to use the phrase AI or machine learning because those are buzzwords, but I think that's what they're sold as, right? Like these tools that can help you get better insights on things, and that kind of the marrying of the two practices, right? So if somebody's trying to get started in that space, like maybe they're a more traditional data science approach, or maybe they're a young girl in Texas who like loves computers, like how do people get started in this sort of world?
That's a great question. So I personally think that any sort of project that you first investigate should begin with exploratory data analysis. Like it doesn't mean that you can't sort of move to more of a machine learning based approach with scikit-learn, or with other traditional machine learning frameworks, or even deep learning with TensorFlow or with PyTorch. But really, to start thinking about a problem, you have to understand your data.
Sure.
And there's a ton of interesting insight that you can just extract from like looking at the data sets that are freely available online. There's so Kaggle, as an example, kaggle.com/datasets has many open source data sets that folks can take a look at. NASA open sources all of their data. So satellite imagery, telemetry from satellites about planets and about stars, all of those things are freely available online for you to go about exploring. And then the tools that you would need for just kind of like looking at data,
Yep.
understanding it. We have Jupyter notebooks as well as notebooks in VS Code if you're interested in more of like a fully fleshed IDE. But the Python tools that would be helpful would be just pandas, matplotlib, perhaps NumPy and SciPy. But I'm also happy to share links about introductory data science and machine learning courses, and also some links to particularly interesting data sets. But I also strongly think that like the best way, like honestly, the best way to get into this is figure out a problem that you care about. Like whether it's understanding how many pink shoes are available
Sure.
to purchase on Amazon, or like understanding like baseball statistics for the
Yeah.
last however many months. But figure out a problem that you're really really curious about, because that's the best incentive ever to go and learn a technology. Um,
Yeah, that stuff is great. I think one thing that's also important to call is that maybe if you're, I guess, nervous or apprehensive about going deep in the weeds here, there are lots of visualization tools out there that you can take data set of choice and do all sorts of fun things with it, right?
yeah,
Tableau or Power BI or like a lot of these
yeah,
tools that exist that allow you to just say, "Oh, here's all this data," like maybe uh, you know, Kaggle, some of the data sets from Kaggle.com. You ingest
yeah,
that, and then you're able to just play around with it and learn things. Like you mentioned
absolutely.
things like sports statistics, right? Like I'm very much interested in baseball statistics because I think that baseball is so like most of baseball, in my opinion, is very random events, right?
Hmm.
And it's interesting, like extrapolating, like okay, how random are these events, right? Because success is like literally like failing only like 60% of the time, like that's
Hmm.
success, right? And I think that stuff like that is very interesting to me, but I couldn't
Yeah,
get into the weeds of trying to figure out all creating all these complex formulas. The formulas are already there. I can just look at the data and slice it and get some insights that are valuable to me. And I think that's a great way to start for some people that may be a bit more apprehensive to it.
absolutely. And speaking of GUI based tools like Sheets and Excel,
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
is they offer so many capabilities, and I will always prefer, like, if I have a tabular data set, so like a CSV or a TSV or whatever it happens to be, I will always prefer interacting with it in Sheets or Excel first and visualizing it there,
Yeah.
as opposed to like reaching for a programmatic tool, because it's just so much quicker.
Yeah.
And yeah, and the purpose is, to get enchanted by data, to understand what's there, and to ask more interesting questions. And like, if you can do all that in a GUI based environment, heck yeah,
Yeah.
like,
Of
all the
course.
more power. Yeah,
What is
absolutely.
the meme, right? Spreadsheets are the original programming language. Like, isn't that like the meme, right? Where it's, I mean, I think
Yeah.
if you're in tech, or even if you're not in tech, if you've come across spreadsheets in your career, you've came across a spreadsheet that you have no idea how it does some of the things that it does, and it's like
Mhm.
that's like a piece of gold, right? Like, don't delete that spreadsheet, don't modify the formulas, don't do any of these things, right? I
Yeah.
mean, I think in general, are you very spreadsheet driven, like in your personal life too? And the reason why I ask is because I definitely am. Like all my stuff is in spreadsheets. It drives my wife crazy. Um,
Absolutely.
yeah.
Absolutely. And it's also like, so as an example, for Google, some of Google's products, the backing for Google Forms are all spreadsheets,
Yep.
right? Like, and being able to use it is kind of like, makeshift database situation, for whatever kind of web app that you've created, is super interesting to me, and it makes a ton of sense. Because, working, and I believe Excel also has this functionality as well. Like, you can make changes to this underlying data structure and then have it immediately expressed as part of a web app or whatever it happens to be. But certainly I'm very spreadsheet driven. I
Yeah.
think that, it's the best tech tool ever created and still the most understandable way to go about doing work. And all of finance runs on spreadsheets,
Sure.
like finance, supply chain, logistics, everybody's using spreadsheets with VBA. Um,
Yeah. I think one of my most unforgettable, memorable jobs I had was I was a consultant at the time, and I was asked to go with a few other people to go to a very large bank in New York City and basically
mhm.
take this spreadsheet that was breaking every time people made changes to it because it was so big, like turn that into something not a spreadsheet that can continue to work, right? And we're talking about thousands of lines in VBA and just all these macros and these crazy formulas that like you had to copy and paste into like Notepad to actually see the entire formula. It was an
Yeah.
absolute nightmare. But I remembered something really quickly after talking with some of the people that use the spreadsheet, and they saw the spreadsheet, like the spreadsheet concept in general is like just magic. You make one
Yeah.
change in one cell and then literally like workbook, like all the worksheets update. Like it's just some of these things are just outside the scope of like I could never do this like with a pen and paper ever. And I think that's
Yeah.
one of the empowering things about technology, right?
Mhm.
I you started off talking a little bit about your early career in the aerospace industry as well as is oil and natural gas, and then you kind of made this transition into kind of more like very developer focused work. You want to talk a little bit about that and what kind of empowered you or motivated you to want to do something like that?
Oh, absolutely. And that's a great question. I had been so I'd been working at Chevron for quite a bit of time. I was doing grad school at night, and then it also founded this thing in Houston called PyLadies. It's a Python women's programming meetup, and it was so much fun. And we would sort of chat every week. We would, work on open source projects. That's how I started getting much more involved with, Jupyter, NumPy, SciPy, and all the great folks in Texas who are working on Thought Canopy, which was a scientific computing environment that has since sort of declined in usage, as well as Anaconda, which is also based in Texas. And they manage Conda, the open source project, as well as Conda Forge and some of the other sort of open source tools. And it was just so interesting to me. Like I would go to work during the day and then like nights and weekends having this double secret life of like working on open source projects, working on developer
Yeah.
tools, teaching people Python, like all these sorts of things. And then Microsoft, they sort of reached out about this role as a developer advocate and said, so hey, all of those things that you do in your spare time,
Yeah.
how would you like to get paid to do those and like have that be your primary job? And I didn't even know that was a thing that existed. And
Yeah.
so being able to go and talk to people about Python and machine learning and data science on cloud architecture that I was, using at work, but like didn't know was hard for people to understand. So being able to do that full time was just, oh God, it's like
Yeah.
universe brain or galaxy brain or whatever it is.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, and so that was my entrance into tech, and I could not have imagined a better introduction of like starting as a developer advocate. I worked for as a software engineer a little bit after, and then eventually just recently moved to PM only a few years ago. But this sort of this idea of enabling others and teaching them
Yeah.
and building examples, tutorials, etc. It's just I honestly can't imagine a better job.
Yeah.
And like and we are also hiring. I think I'm supposed to like say that
Oh,
at
sure.
some point. But it's like if you get excited about developer tools or open source work or any and all of the above, like there are certainly places for you at Microsoft as well as many, many other places in the
Yeah.
tech industry. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean that's completely spot on. I think one thing that I really love about the work that I do, it's about enabling people to do things that they previously didn't think they were capable of doing, right?
Yep.
And part of that is storytelling, part of that is education, and part of that is just wanting like for people to have the same passion about things that I do, right?
Yep.
I think that's when it boils down to people will ask me, oh, how do I do this or how do I do that? And my question always, or my answer is always like, well, is it something that you want to do? Or is it something that you feel like you need to do to kind of progress whatever you want? Because, and I don't know if you feel the same way, but working in tech is pretty painful, right? Like there's a lot of struggles. Like, we feed off of the positives, like if our builds don't break, if we see the UI update the particular way we want, like we get off on those things because we fight through all these bugs and scrum
Yeah.
meetings and all these things that are kind of lesser on the excitement scale, right?
Yes.
So a lot of people that I've talked to, and I'm picking this up from you too, is that you could have easily probably gone into academia and teaching and enjoyed and have a fulfilled life just the same, right? And I think
Mhm.
that's really resonating because really great teachers, they just like to teach, right?
Yeah.
And, whether you're a teacher in science in a high school, or teaching, applied systems at a university, or you're teaching, the next level of engineers to be developers, working for a company. These are all things that, like, they all have the baseline thing. They want people to learn. They love learning and love seeing other people learn.
Yep. And being able to effectively communicate, why something is important, and
Yeah.
then also how it might be useful to them in particular. And I think that that messaging aspect is extremely challenging to do effectively in the tech
Yep.
industry. And so like marketing in particular is responsible for this, right? Of like
Yep.
being able to, take a product and help people realize how that product could be useful to them in particular and for their kinds of use cases. And also straightforward for them in particular to learn and to understand.
Yeah.
And that's huge.
Yeah.
It is, and it really is the most empowering thing in the world to take someone, like Power Apps in particular, or, like the if this then that,
Yep.
the automation things online. I always get so enchanted by seeing like the people who have no programming background whatsoever,
Yep.
but who have these ideas and they're able to, put together the components that they need in order to do something meaningful and useful
Yep.
and like, life changing for so many of them and their colleagues. Like it's just it's great to see that. And then like you said, like there are always the instances of like, oh hey, I'm using this open source library and it doesn't seem to be working. Oh yes, it's
Yeah.
because it's maintained by some guy in Iowa for 2 hours a week.
Yeah.
This sort of thing. Yeah.
Yeah, that's the funny thing too about open source, is that, I have this conversation a lot with people, because I think just in general it goes down this route, is that open source is kind of treated like a commodity, right? Where people consume it, and then when they're no longer in need of it, they discard it, right? Even though it's, thousands of hours of work by people. Um, what I think is really interesting over the last few years is this huge advocacy to, find ways to support open source contributors, whether it be, GitHub sponsorship, or some of the other tools that exist out there for sponsorship, or, larger companies, helping contribute to open source. And these things are just, they help impact the community.
Yep.
I'd like to get your thoughts on, especially in this space where I think it's fair to say that there's probably, it's a small subset of people that are engineers that are really interested in data analysis. Like, how can we, increase that number? How can we make people more excited about data related acts in computer science? Because a lot of the work that we do obviously is, here's a database, write a website that reads over that database and then updates it, right? Like forms over data type stuff. And the more complex things, like some of the work that you've done, it's still very important, but there's probably a need for people in this space.
Absolutely. And I know I probably sound redundant with a lot of other folks that you've talked to, but just contributing to documentation
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
adding like usage examples is huge, because for all of these engineers who are interested in learning more about data, we can look at a Python file and, it might just be raw code with some doc strings. But it's meaningful, we can figure out and kind of piece out what it's doing. But for every one, Python developer that can do that, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of people who are just learning and who would not be able
Yeah.
to understand how to hold an API correctly just by looking at the source code.
Sure.
So certainly, like if you do have interest in this space, I will ask, as many times as I can, like, folks, please contribute to
Yeah.
documentation. And also, like, I'm so glad you brought up GitHub sponsorships, because it is oftentimes, open source is, it's free like in puppy, not free like in beer.
Sure.
And
Yeah.
so like, if you take it, like you need to take care of it as well. And sort of make sure that, the library that you're using as part of your internal system or as part of your analysis is kept up to date. The bugs are getting fixed, and the best way to do that is, to help fund the experts or to ensure that they have funds so that they can either outsource some of the work or they can sponsor an outreach
Yep.
scholarship or a Google Summer of Code internship or whatever it happens to be. Um,
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of stuff to unpack there. I think the biggest thing is that you can contribute to open source in any way, right?
yes,
Even like I use this, it doesn't work for me in these particular use cases. I'm going to open up an issue.
yes, yes.
Or, hey, I want to contribute, but I might not know what I'm doing. I'd like to kind of have a conversation with you and use a discussion. And it's funny how like everything is like a GitHub feature, like in open source now. Like I think about this a lot where it's, GitHub is synonymous with open source, obviously. But like even now we use like the GitHub terms in trying to using discussions or issues or, it's just funny how the community gravitated towards a particular tool because the community saw value in that tool. And
Absolutely.
I, you know, for people in the data science world, like what are some other tools that people play in? Like, I know you mentioned some of the open source data sets that exist out there, but is predominantly do most of the people that, are in the data science / computer science space, are they all on GitHub too?
They are I believe the majority of folks are on GitHub. Certainly every open source package that I use is GitHub first. All of the
Mm-hmm.
development and discussion happens there. There are usually, so people are starting to investigate discussions, which I think is a great new feature that GitHub has added, so you can, instead of necessarily opening up an issue to have a conversation, you
Yep.
can refer to issues within discussion
Yep.
posts and discussion forums. I know that Discourse is also a popular alternative for folks. Jupyter, for example, and PyTorch both have Discourse forums that are really sort of heavily trafficked, both with questions and then also with people saying like, hey, look at this cool thing I built.
Yeah.
Let's try it out and let's see. And then of course, answering Stack Overflow questions is also always
Yeah.
a wonderful way to contribute back to open source. But definitely data science community is certainly on GitHub. And there are, I honestly wish that there was a little bit more of a sort of catalog approach for these user communities on
Yeah.
GitHub in general. And if folks have ideas around that, would love to chat more. I think there's a huge opportunity for sort of growing this community mentality even more around GitHub itself. It is a social network, kind of
Sure. It is. Very much is.
it's yeah, the social network for software engineers, or at least open source software engineers.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you can create and edit a profile now. I mean, like that's a
Yep.
pretty big deal. Like, I
Yep.
think I don't know if you dabbled in MySpace, but I think MySpace was like
Oh,
the first level of GitHub, right? Because
yep.
you could add CSS and JavaScript to your profile pages and like break browsers and all this sort of great stuff. And then kind of it went away from that, and then it's like, okay, well, this is what your profile looks like, and you keep it forever. And now GitHub
Mm,
recently with their profile abilities, like you just editing a README file using Markdown, like you can have like cool stuff in there. Like you can put in
absolutely.
CSS, like low levels of CSS and interesting things. You can also do even weird things too. Like me personally, like I have my profile page, I update it every 5 minutes using like GitHub Actions. So
Oh,
like
cool.
I had like I used to be like show like what my team stat when I worked at Microsoft. I used to show what my team status was. So like it would show like, oh, Isaac is busy on Teams or Isaac is available on Teams or whatever. Just because I wanted to like learn like how to do something interesting other than just kind of put a bunch of markdown into my profile. So there's some cool stuff to do out there with profiles. I would highly recommend playing around with them. Um,
Excellent.
yeah, I think too one thing that's kind of interested me about the I guess the marriage of data and computer science is that now people use all sorts of different tools to do things. We've talked a little bit about them, but one of them I'd really like to talk about, just because I was introduced to it probably fairly recently, in the last 2 or 3 years. This, like Jupyter, right? And
Yep.
how people can, again, like you mentioned earlier, like an IDE over data in an effective way. What do you like so much about Jupyter?
Absolutely. That's a great question. So I started using like Jupyter in terms of its evolution. It started off as these kind of IPython notebooks before moving into Jupyter. And then now there's also kind of an even more fully featured IDE called Jupyter Lab. So you can have notebooks that are like single files that you can sort of experiment and run code. So for folks who perhaps haven't seen it before, you can have cells that are marked down, and perhaps they're describing some things that are going to happen in the cell immediately below that's in Python or in C# or .NET or in any of the other languages that are supported as notebook kernels. And then Jupyter Lab gives you an IDE that looks like a little bit less fully featured VS Code, kind of, that allows you to have certain kinds of panes. But we also very excitingly have notebooks in VS Code, which give you the ability to look at Python files and also notebook files and have all the great IntelliSense debugging support, kind of the advanced refactoring that you would be able to experience in something like VS or VS Code or like PyCharm. But the thing that I really do love the most about notebooks is kind of what we were touching on before, this idea of immediate feedback.
Yep.
So like you can type something in, you hit Shift Enter, and you immediately see a response. And you can sort of change cells, you can move cells around, you can delete or hide cells, but it's really all focused on this idea of literate programming, of being able
Yeah.
to use Markdown and code to tell a story. And I really love that, because it's I'm a huge fan of documentation. I'm sure you are as well. But
Yeah. Yeah.
like yeah, but being able to have kind of like it's explanations as a first class citizen sitting next to code it's really important to me. And I don't think that happens a whole bunch otherwise, just if you have like a C++ file or like a
Sure.
regular Python file or whatever it happens to be.
Yeah, I think, one of the things that I take from, what you were saying, and just in general, a lot of these tools, is that it's about reducing friction, right?
Yep.
Like, I'm getting started, or maybe I'm even, I'm fair along in my career in a certain space, right? Like, I don't want to have to go through all of the pomp and circumstance of like doing these things, right? Something as simple as like, oh, I know that I want to run these particular Python scripts on top of data that looks like this. I don't want to have to like ingest that data using some Python library and then walk through line by line. Like, I want to be able to see like immediate results, right?
Mhm.
Like, those sort of things are really impactful for people, because I don't know about you, but me personally, like, I respond far better to visual cues than like, I not that I hate debugging, but debugging to me is always like a pain, like a huge pain, like stepping line by line through things. So if any tool allows me to like have like some UI on top of stuff, that's great. Like, I love CLIs, don't get me wrong. I love talking about CLIs, but I'd much rather would go down the UI route, because I think that's how my brain works a bit better.
Absolutely. And I agree with you, especially for some use cases as well. So like as an example, get via the command line.
Yeah,
I have yet to meet someone who adores get via the command line. And
sure.
so
Yeah.
yep, so using the GitHub extension within VS Code, which has the visual interface, you click some buttons to make your pull request and to sort of stage changes. That jives much better with the way that my brain works.
Yep.
And it's the same with, I was playing with a library just recently called Myabi, which allows you to do kind of 3D plots and visualizations using Python, but you can make changes, like when your 3D visualization pops up, you can make changes to it. And then, and if you had hit the record button as you were making changes, it spits out the equivalent Python code that would create that visualization in the first place. And
That's
so,
okay.
yeah, and
That's
so
pretty crazy.
I adore tools like this. That's like, all right, here's a GUI interface, like make whatever changes you want. And then like the equivalent Python code is generated for you. And you can just plop it into a notebook or plop it into a file. And, you know, it's a little bit easier to maintain over time, which is great.
Hmm.
But you don't have like the pain as a user of attempting to figure out those incantations yourself.
Yeah.
So,
I mean,
yeah.
like code generation in general is because I think code generation has been around for a while for a lot of things like API specifications and things like that. But now we get more and more into like these models that exist. Things like GitHub Copilot or Visual Studio and Telecode, like these things that again, like it's all about making tools better for people and getting you from point A to point B the fastest way possible instead of having to circumnavigate the globe trying to solve your problems, right? I do think that there's a ton of like really really interesting things in this space, like, and I know that you're very excited. I've seen you talk about Copilot on Twitter a little bit. Like, what excites you so much about Copilot?
So Copilot is, for folks who might not be familiar, there's a company called OpenAI, which created a while back a sort of massive model called GPT-3. And GPT-3 can do things like generate text. So you might seed it with a single sentence and it gives you back a paragraph or a full page. It can create visualizations. It can create, like even source code now from plain descriptions.
Sure.
Yep. So Copilot, the way that it works in practice is that if you're in VS Code, you're in a Python file, you might type out a comment to the effect of like, take in this CSV file and merge these two columns and also remove all of the null values. And you might just write that comment, you hit enter, you start a Python function, and then the entire function is generated for you. And it works surprisingly well.
Yeah.
To me, like I was shocked to see how much code it can generate, and then also like how sort of idiomatic the code happens to be. But it's done by sort of looking at all of the repos that are open source on GitHub today,
Yep.
and saying like, a person would probably be searching for code samples that do whatever they need it to
Sure.
do regardless.
Sure.
But just kind of populating that in for you, as opposed to, you having to go scour the internet in
Yeah.
order to find the Stack Overflow or the GitHub example or the documentation example that would meet your needs. So I adore that. I adore like the reduction in time from like, first of all, breaking me out of my flow, right? Like of like, all right, man, I don't remember what particular API I need for this particular thing. Like I have to go like first to, like my favorite search engine. Then I have to like think of what I'm trying to get
Yeah.
it to do or like what the documentation might say. And then like look through, top 10 examples to see which one is the one that I actually need. And by the time I get back to my IDE, it's like, ah, man, like I wasted
Yeah.
10 minutes. Like,
Yeah. Lost my
um,
train of thought or whatever.
exactly. And so Copilot keeps you in your flow. It sort of functions as the kind of person sitting next to you being like, oh yeah, it's this API.
Yeah.
And is a little bit of a pair programming experience, as you're going about your development. And I use it every day. I use it both for like creating markdown files,
Yeah.
because it does a lot of really nice formatting for markdown, but also especially for these like very, kind of kludgy, data mungy
Sure.
with Python code.
Yeah, I think one of the like I got access to Copilot fairly early, and I one of the things that I first realized when I first started playing around with it was like, oh, like this literally does a Google search for me, right?
Yep.
Like and I mean, it doesn't get you all the way there every single time, but I was quite
Yep.
surprised that it gets me like nine of the 10 steps there pretty
Yep.
consistently, which I think is really impactful because I don't want us to be completely replaced by machines just yet. Like maybe wait until I retire until people get replaced by machines. But I think, you know, if I can focus on the problems that only I can solve, right? Like some crazy for loop algorithm that does some things like I don't really need that. Like I don't need that in my brain. Like
Yeah.
if I can just say like, "Oh, I'm trying to do something like this," and then some magic helper like gives me a snippet of code that gets me a good chunk of the way there, like I'm able to focus on the things that I want to work on to be successful. And I think that's part of the beauty of something like Copilot is that it just gives you the ability to focus on what you really really enjoy. And this is why
Yep.
another reason why I love open source so much is that we're able to focus like I don't want to have to write like a string interpolator for something like some genius has already written that. Like so I can just use
Yep.
that instead of having to kind of reinvent the wheel time and time again, which I think is really invaluable.
Absolutely. And I don't know if you've experienced the same thing, but I feel like Copilot is influencing me to be a better communicator because the
Sure.
better descriptions you can give of what you would like to have happen in your code, like the better results Copilot gives you.
Yes.
Um, yep. And so that's made me feel a lot more confident when working with some of, like early career employees or defining snippets of work for engineering teams. It's like, all right, I need to be very clear on these particular aspects. Like I can't just be nebulous about what particular features I need to have included. But it's super interesting. And like I said, I adore working with Copilot. Have been using it, as soon as they gave me access. And I think, it's one of the ways that AI can help enable developer productivity, that I would have never imagined 10 years ago.
Oh, I totally agree. I think it's again, like we've talked about a lot of tools today, right? Tools that make our lives easier as developers. And that's as a developer, I'm lazy, so I want to use as many tools as possible to make my life easier. Um,
Yep.
yeah, and so as we wrap up, we're at the top of the hour. So Paige, I want to thank you so much for coming on and chatting with me just about what you're interested in about tech and open source. And I hope all the folks that tuned in, like they really saw like different avenues for you to get into open source and into tech than, kind of more, I guess, more traditional routes. Um, as we wrap up, one of the last things I like to ask my guests before we sign off is if you could think of open source or technology in general using only one word, what would that be for you?
Oh, community.
Community? All right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Community is great. Like I think that's probably our most used one because it's pretty accurate. So,
Yeah.
yeah. Excellent. Well, again, Paige, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say thank you so much for
Yeah.
having me. This has been, I cannot imagine a better way to spend the morning than to be chatting about open source and about developer tools. This is so much fun.
Well, you're so kind. Thank you so much for tuning in, everybody. Thank you, Paige, for being here. And everybody, enjoy the rest of your day. Take care.